Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining from. Thanks for being with us for this webinar on the role of renewable natural gas in state climate policy. My name is Dan Lashoff, and I'm the director of WRI, the United States. For those of you who aren't familiar with WRI, we are a global think and do tank committed to tackling the world's most pressing problems at the intersection of the environment, economics, development, and equity. Our approach starts with science and data. We call that count it. We then help identify, design, and analyze solutions, change it, and we work with partners in government and the private sector and the nonprofit community to replicate proven approaches to scale those solutions. In the United States, our primary focus is supporting the transition to a net zero emissions economy by no later than 2050. Until last week, that meant focusing on supporting leadership by states, cities, and the private sector. We now have important new opportunities to also engage the federal government, but that does not diminish the importance of continuing leadership at the subnational level. And we'll be talking about that role with respect to states and renewable natural gas today. This builds on work that we've done that you can find on our website on climate federalism, an area that we'll continue to focus on. There is no silver bullet for deep decarbonization. The transition is going to require a multifaceted approach with different technologies addressing different emission sources and end-use sectors. The WRUS program works on a broad portfolio of technology and policy solutions, including carbon removal, hydrogen, electricity markets, industrial sector decarbonization, RNG, and others. Specifically, our research on renewable natural gas has shown that it can be part of a broader toolkit of climate strategies, both as an option to capture methane emissions from organic waste and as a way to displace fossil fuel use, particularly in hard to abate sectors. However, as with any strategy, state policymakers, of course, face questions on what types of investments can lead to the most significant climate benefits and how RNG fits in alongside a mix of other strategies, including electrification. While these are tough questions to tackle, WRI has tried to inform the discussion with our recently released paper, Renewable Natural Gas as a Climate Strategy, Guidance for State Policymakers. Our aim is to provide a resource, and with today's webinar as well, to bring together key stakeholders to share insights from experts and highlight the latest data and trends to enable informed decision-making. Today's content will include a summary of research insights from our paper, and then we'll move to a presentation from regional experts who can provide insights into how policy and project development are evolving and playing out in a variety of different contexts. So we hope to have you engaged in this discussion. We'll welcome questions from the audience throughout today's webinar using the Q&A feature. We're also recording this, and so if you have colleagues who want to tune in later, we'll make a link to the recording available in a day or so, and we'll provide information on that in the chat. So finally, just before turning it over to my colleague, Tom Sears, to present the key findings from our research paper, I want to thank the UPS Foundation, which provided support for this work and previous work on RNG, and to our working group of stakeholders who contributed greatly to our efforts to pull this information together. So with that, let me turn it over to Tom Sears, a research associate at WRI and lead author of our paper.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. And as Dan mentioned, over the following slides here, we'll be providing a quick overview of RNG and its potential as a climate strategy, summarizing some key takeaways from our most recent paper, and walking through high-level concepts before we hand things over to our guest speakers, who we're very excited to have, and they'll provide some more detailed regional context on the topic. So next slide, please. So before diving in, though, just wanted to give some quick background on WRI's work on RNG. So for the last several years, WRI has been doing independent research on RNG as a climate strategy. And we do this in three primary ways. The first is through convenings and dialogues. So bringing together stakeholders across academia, government, and industry to inform our work. And that includes some of our guest speakers who we have on the webinar today. We also do this through research. So releasing research papers, blogs, and other materials to distill insights. And that includes our most recent research paper on RNG, which we certainly welcome everybody to check out. And then also this includes outreach, so engaging with both technical audiences and the general public on these topics. Next slide, please. So always think it's helpful to start out with a quick definition here. So when we're talking about renewable natural gas or RNG, we're typically talking about biogas derived from organic wastes that has been upgraded and processed to be interchangeable with fossil natural gas or conventional natural gas. RNG can be produced from a wide array of organic waste streams, but common sources include landfills, food waste, animal manure, and wastewater plants. And since RNG can be produced from many different sources, it also has a wide array of environmental impacts. However, common benefits that can result from RNG projects include more sustainable waste management, reductions in methane emissions from organic wastes, and the displacement of fossil fuels in downstream applications. Also, it's important to note that most RNG projects rely on pretty well-established technology. So anaerobic digester projects that convert organic waste to biogas to generate on-site heat or electricity have been around for decades in the US. What is a more recent development, though, and what separates an RNG project from traditional biogas projects is the upgrading of the fuel so that the methane content essentially makes it essentially interchangeable with natural gas. And the number of projects now conducting this upgrading from biogas to RNG has grown dramatically in recent years, thanks in large part to federal and state fuel mandates. So next slide, please. So what are the climate impacts of RNG? As many attending this webinar are, I'm sure, aware, climate benefits can range significantly from feedstock to feedstock and project to project. And this is illustrated in the figure on the left here, showing the average carbon intensity of currently approved California low carbon fuel standard projects, which can range from, for example, landfill projects, which on average yield some emissions benefits relative to conventional natural gas and definitely relative to diesel fuel, all the way down to animal manure projects, which on average are actually can be significantly net negative in terms of their emissions per unit of energy. So these values rely on a life cycle accounting approach, which is commonly used in state level assessments of RNG, and is also the basis for state level regulatory programs such as the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard and Oregon's Clean Fuel Program. Just to walk through how these benefits are calculated in a bit more detail, if we take a hypothetical food waste RNG project as shown on the right here, calculating life cycle emissions essentially involves having a balance sheet where you have emission sources on one side, including energy consumed for feedstock conversion, combustion emissions, any potential methane leakage, as well as credits on the other side, including, for example, avoided flaring and methane emissions if the waste was otherwise landfilled. And this is essentially done so that impacts can be compared to a reference case in which RNG is not produced and the feedstocks are managed according to existing practices. So while impacts vary significantly from one project to the next, some general rules of thumb that we've published in previous research are that projects are most likely to yield benefits when they are A, derived from wastes rather than dedicated uses of land, and B, they result in a net reduction in methane emissions. Next slide, please. So now moving on to the fundamental issue of what RNG's potential role is in decarbonization. Some basic questions here. A first order question is how much can be produced? And a second basic question is where can it be deployed? And in terms of production, studies find that wet waste sources in the US, which include food waste or animal manure, and which are converted to biogas through anaerobic digestion technology, could eventually yield as much as 780 to 1,400 billion cubic feet of biomethane, which would be equivalent to roughly 4 to 7% of present day natural gas consumption in the US across the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors. If we include dry waste resources, which are, for example, crop residues or forestry residues, research finds that total potential could be as high as 2,000 BCF of biomethane, which would be equivalent to roughly 11% of current natural gas consumption. Although conversion of these types of dry wastes relies on more nascent gasification technology. So at a high level, what these estimates indicate is that much more RNG can be produced relative to what is produced at today's levels. But at the same time, even at the high end of resource supply potential, at least when we're talking about organic wastes, it's still unlikely to be able to fully displace fossil fuel use in any one sector, such as buildings or transportation. Despite this, RNG can play a complementary role alongside other decarbonization strategies, and a growing number of modeling studies point to the value of an integrated approach to reducing energy emissions, including rapid electrification of vehicles and appliances, as well as the use of some combustion-based fuels such as RNG and hydrogen for end uses that are otherwise difficult to electrify, at least in the near term, such as heavy-duty vehicles or industrial heating. So how all of this actually plays out over time is, of course, uncertain, but a general takeaway is that while RNG is certainly not a substitute for electrification or adding wind and solar to the electric grid, it can be deployed to achieve additional emissions reductions alongside these strategies or serve as a bridge fuel as technology continues to develop. Next slide, please. And finally, before closing out, we just wanted to touch on the myriad of policy options that states have at their disposal to potentially advance RNG deployment. There are a variety of different policy options, but three overarching buckets that we identify are climate and energy mandates, which can set explicit requirements for the share of renewable fuels in the transportation sector, for example. Public financial support, so policies that promote project development through grants and loans or other public financing, and a sort of catch-all category of enabling policies, which can include regulatory actions that have important direct or indirect effects on project deployment, such as pipeline gas specification requirements. There's really no one-size-fits-all approach here, since different states and regions have very different political and economic contexts. So what we highlight in our most recent research paper is how different types of policies link to different barriers on the ground and may connect to various state-level priorities. For example, California's low carbon fuel standard has played a significant role in attracting investment and creating demand for RNG as a transportation fuel. The program also values RNG based on life cycle emissions impacts, and so has the effect of incentivizing projects that contribute to the state's goals of reducing methane emissions from animal manure and other wastes. As another example, state grant and loan programs for digester projects can help ensure that in-state projects are prioritized, and that projects are prioritized which meet specific criteria, perhaps regarding location or environmental co-benefits, such as reduced air and water pollution from organic wastes. And to give just one more example, waste management policies, such as food waste recycling mandates, can provide an important market signal to drive demand for additional project capacity and incentivize the diversion of waste to more productive uses, such as anaerobic digestion and conversion to RNG. So certainly a lot to unpack there, but hopefully that provides a good overview of some of these policies that states have taken or are considering taking. And we'll now hand it back over to Dan, who will introduce our guest speakers to delve into these topics a little bit more deeply. So thank you.
Unmute. Thanks, Tom. So we have three guest speakers. I'll introduce each of them in turn, and they'll give a a few minutes of remarks from their perspective, working on really implementing RNG at the state or regional level, and then we'll have a panel discussion with each of them and Tom to join to answer questions that some people have submitted beforehand, and also I see we're getting some questions coming in the Q&A. So we'll do our best to answer your questions. If we don't get to them during this session, we will make them available to panelists if they're able to follow up afterwards. So hopefully, please continue to ask questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. But without further delay, let me turn it to Rebecca Smith. Rebecca has worked on policy related to climate change and renewable energy for over 14 years. She's currently senior policy analyst at the Oregon Department of Energy, where she focuses on alternative transportation fuels, especially in the medium and heavy duty sectors, and issues related to natural gas, including RNG. Prior to joining the Oregon Department of Energy, Ms. Smith worked on greenhouse gas mitigation policies and corporate climate risk reduction at organizations including Earth Advantage Institute, at Norska Veritas, and EcoSecurity. So, Rebecca Smith, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Next slide, please. Today, I will be discussing some of the early progress Oregon has made with RNG. First, I'll give you a lay of the land in Oregon with respect to our clean energy policies to better place our RNG efforts in context. I'll list the recent legislation related to RNG, and then I'll dive into the programs these bills have enabled, including our RNG inventory, our new utility RNG program, and our clean fuels program. Next slide. In Oregon, we have 3 natural gas utilities. By far the largest is Northwest Natural, followed by Cascade and Avista. The map on the right shows Northwest Natural's service territory, which is almost exclusively the western part of the state where we have our largest cities. Avista and Cascade service territories include smaller patches around the state, and Oregon is one of those states where many of the rural parts of the state are without natural gas utility service. Next slide. The new RNG policies I'll talk about fit into a larger landscape of clean energy legislation in Oregon. So for example, we've had an RPS since 2008, and our current target is 50% renewable by 2040 for our largest utilities. We also have greenhouse gas reduction goals, and these were recently updated by executive order to 75% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2050. Our most populous county, Multnomah County, which includes Portland, recently adopted 100% renewable electricity goal by 2035 and 100% renewable energy by 2050. And then with respect to transportation, Oregon's Clean Fuel Program launched in 2016, and Oregon is also a signatory to the Multi-State Medium and Heavy Duty Zero Emissions Vehicle MOU, which is where states are working towards the goal of 100% all new medium and heavy duty vehicle sales as zero emissions by 2050. Next slide, please. So we've had 2 big pieces of RNG legislation in Oregon recently. The first in 2017 directed ODO to inventory the RNG resources into the state, in the state, and I'll go into that in a moment. The second bill, SB 98, directed our Public Utility Commission to adopt rules for natural gas utility RNG programs. Also, we're seeing more interest in hydrogen in Oregon, and often RNG and hydrogen are discussed together. So this session, we have a bill that's been introduced to provide property tax exemptions for facilities producing hydrogen using electrolysis or RNG. Next slide. So for our RNG inventory, we looked at 6 pathways. 4 were wet waste pathways for anaerobic digestion, and 2 were dry pathways for thermal gasification. We found an annual potential of about 10 BCF for RNG from anaerobic digestion, and this represents about 4.5% of Oregon's annual natural gas consumption, exclusive of electricity generation. We also found an annual potential of about 40 BCF from RNG for thermal gasification. And so that brings our kind of total theoretical potential in Oregon to 50 billion cubic feet, which represents about 22% of Oregon's annual natural gas consumption. The inventory also estimated various greenhouse gas emission reduction benefits from different uses of RNG. Next slide, please. So here you can see the totals for all the production pathways we looked at. You can see here that that potential from thermal gasification of dry feedstocks absolutely dwarfs that of anaerobic digestion of wet feedstocks. However, as Tom mentioned, that gasification is really a nascent technology, not really seeing commercial scale deployment of it in the US yet. And so these numbers for these dry wet feedstocks are definitely very theoretical. Next slide, please. The RNG inventory also looked at different challenges and provided recommendations to support wider deployment of RNG, as well as next steps to build on this initial RNG. Two other recommendations: allowing natural gas companies to buy and sell RNG for their customers and allowing recovery of pipeline interconnection costs, have now been addressed by legislation, SB 98. For next steps, ODO would like to develop a practical statewide RNG potential. And we'd also like to do more targeted economic analyses related to the RNG production pathways, and as well as market economics and drivers. Next slide, please. Moving on, in 2019, the Oregon legislature passed SB 98, which allows natural gas utilities in the state to buy and sell RNG to retail customers and to recover the costs via rates. This is a voluntary program in that natural gas utilities may opt in if they wish to provide RNG to their customers, but they're not obliged to. And the costs and the benefits are shared across all ratepayers. The legislation specifically defines parameters for large utility programs, and Northwest Natural is our only utility to meet that threshold. So for them, they may spend up to 5% of their annual revenue requirement to cover the incremental costs of RNG. And they may add up to 5% RNG by volume to its mix starting in 2020, with a terminal cap of 30% of their mix by 2050. Next slide, please. The PUC in Oregon opened its rulemaking in 2019 to implement this legislation, and that process tackled a number of questions, but I'm going to focus on the first two: environmental attributes and interactions with existing programs. Next slide, please. So with respect to environmental attributes, PUC and stakeholders determined that defining these attributes of RNG according to the carbon intensity of a particular source of RNG was the most effective way to address concerns around both double counting of those attributes and then also interactions with previously established markets for RNG, namely the California and Oregon clean fuels programs. Both of these programs use a carbon intensity approach. So for each decatherm of RNG in Oregon, the environmental attributes are represented by a renewable thermal certificate, or RTC. And these will be tracked through the MRET's electronic system, much the same way that RECs for our RPS are tracked by Regis. So the RTCs will be used to track the chain of custody of the attributes through a book and claim approach. So we're not physically tracking the RNG. And this is also similar to the accounting for the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard and the Oregon Clean Fuels Program. Next slide, please. Speaking of the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, this program was launched in 2016, and its original goal was to reduce the average carbon intensity of Oregon's transportation fuels by 10% over 10 years. We recently had a gubernatorial executive order that's bumped that goal up to 20% below the baseline of 2015 by 2030 and 25% by 2035. In Oregon, almost all of our transportation fuels are imported, and the program regulates entities that import gasoline, diesel, ethanol, and biodiesel. Credits for the program are generated by entities who provide fuel with a lower carbon intensity than the standard gasoline or diesel it replaces. Next slide, please. So in general, for RNG, as you know, the transportation market has been a very lucrative, albeit volatile, revenue stream for RNG production. So this includes federal RINs, California Low Carbon Fuel Standard credits, and then Oregon Clean Fuels Program credits. So here on the left, you can see the average annual prices for Oregon Clean Fuels credits starting in 2016 at a little over $50 and hitting as high as almost $150 in 2019. The volumes of RNG credited in the program are shown right, and these are broken out by CNG and LNG, and they're in diesel gallon equivalents. One important note on the Clean Fuels program is that generally all liquid fuels, except for LNG, must be reported by volume, whereas gaseous fuels like CNG are opt-in. So you see these dips on this graph, and it's possible that these are just from low reporting quarters since they're not required to report. We're hoping as the program matures, we expect to see greater reporting. Next slide, please. I just wanted to put these RNG numbers in the Clean Fuels program into context. Here are the overall volumes of credits in the Oregon Clean Fuels program by fuel type. And you can see it's dominated by ethanol, biodiesel, and renewable diesel. So those green bars show the category of other, and RNG wouldn't be included in there. Next slide, please. So in terms of what's next for Oregon with RNG, we expect utilities to identify RNG projects and purchasing RNG for their customers as now allowed by SB 98 legislation for utility RNG programs. And Northwest Natural has already moved forward on this. They recently announced a partnership to produce up to 1.2 billion BTUs per year of RNG. We're also expecting to see more RNG production facilities come online, and we have 4 facilities that are already well into the process of development, in addition to what we already have in the state. And then finally, as mentioned, ODO plans to continue its analysis of RNG in the state, and this includes development of that practical RNG potential, and then economic analyses related to those RNG production pathways. So here on the right, just for fun, is the pathway we mapped for thermal gasification in the 2018 inventory. Next slide, please. That's all I have, but I am very happy to answer questions about RNG in Oregon, pardon. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's really, really helpful presentation. A lot going on. And we're going to now turn to Sam Spofford. Sam has served as the Chief Executive Officer of Clean Fuels Ohio since the organization's founding in 2002. Under his leadership, Clean Fuels Ohio has become one of the leading clean cities coalitions, making a major impact on advanced transportation deployment in Ohio. So for a Midwest perspective, we'll turn it to Sam now.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. And thanks also to Tom and World Resources for including me in this webinar. As Dan mentioned, I'm Sam Spofford, and Clean Fuels Ohio is an organization that I've run for about 18, 19 years. We are a statewide nonprofit organization. Our entire focus is on the transportation sector, and we embrace and work to advance a wide range of clean and sustainable fuels and vehicle technologies, and that certainly includes renewable natural gas. It also includes electric vehicles, various biofuels, propane auto gas, hydrogen, and efficiency technologies. We're part of a national network that many of you may have heard of called Clean Cities. It's organized through the U.S. Department of Energy. We're one of about 80 to 85 so-called coalitions in the country. For more information about the DOE's Clean Cities program, you can search for DOE Clean Cities, and you'll see where the coalitions are located across the country in various states. We see RNG as an increasingly important part of a focus on transportation sustainability, and really where the future lies in terms of natural gas vehicle deployments by fleets. Certainly as a heavy duty fuel is kind of where we see RNG fitting, obviously. We've had periodic engagement in RNG as an organization. It's been fairly intermittent because we don't have a lot of funding resources to support the work that we'd like to do on RNG as we do with other fuels, especially EVs. We did host a small conference about 5 years ago, a day-long conference that was focused on deployments of RNG in the transportation sector. I'm going to cover the Midwest, but just as a caveat, my expertise is really in Ohio. I'm going to do the best I can. I've reached out to some colleagues, but I'm sure I'm going to miss a lot of what's going on. So first of all, on the policy front, we do not see too much yet in the Midwest at a state level in terms of statewide climate plans. There are a few that we see emerging, certainly nothing in Ohio at this point. We do see some action at the local level in cities. Unfortunately, none of the programs that I'm aware of or the policies and goals that I'm aware of in Ohio at the local level include a specific component for RNG. We see some other efforts in the Midwest. I think that what I would lift out most from a policy standpoint in the Midwest would be a regional collaboration that's being led by the Great Plains Institute that's focused on advancing policy, being called clean fuels policy, but essentially a low carbon fuel standard at the state level in many Midwestern states. And we're part of that effort to ramp that up. So that's really the major effort. There's been some other things. There's some legislation in Wisconsin that was passed recently to create a clean energy and climate plan. It's got about 100 recommendations. There is a goal for 100% renewables. That's likely to include RNG in some way. Basically, in terms of policy barriers, what I hear most is that we just don't see enough credits that are available locally, within the state nearby. There's a lot of reliance in the Midwest on policies like the low carbon fuel standard in California and Oregon, and then to a degree, the renewable fuel standard at the federal level. Interconnection in the Midwest remains a real barrier. Hopefully, we are going to see some progress there. The RNG Coalition made me aware recently of an interconnection case at FERC that was settled successfully that should help in terms of interconnection in the intercontinental pipelines, the interstate pipelines. There is a case pending in Missouri around interconnection that could have some real positive impact in that state, and perhaps that's a model for elsewhere. One of the folks I spoke with told me that there's really not a lot being done in terms of pursuing this electric vehicle pathway for RNG through the federal RFS, but we will see what happens with the new administration. Generally, just a lot of hoops to jump through is what we hear the most, both in terms of the federal RFS as well as the California low carbon fuel standard. I want to just turn a little bit to the fleet market and the transportation market, since that's kind of what we focus the most on. Generally, I think what's happening with RNG in the Midwest is we're seeing a lot of the market kind of get caught up in these larger dynamics that are really causing a plateauing effect that we've seen for a number of years with CNG in general, based upon very low and stable diesel prices. I think that's hurt adoption of RNG some in Ohio. We're seeing the industry make progress. I think, as many people know, there's been some progress made, certainly on heavy duty natural gas engines. We think more is coming there. Just a few examples of some fleets people may have heard of in the Midwest. Paper transport, a number of others in terms of regional freight. Ozinga is a deployer of renewable natural gas, at least in Michigan, perhaps other locations in the Midwest where they have operations. Fair Oaks Dairy has been an historic user in Indiana of renewable natural gas in their fleets. In Ohio, we have a major long-term user of CNG that is poised to begin using RNG. They're preparing a solicitation. Unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to give the name, was not able to get permission to mention them on this webinar, but feel free to follow up with me on that. On the production side in Ohio, we've got a lot of kind of legacy facilities, solid waste landfill in Franklin County, a very large producer of renewable natural gas, the Rumpke landfill down near Cincinnati, very large producer dating back to the late 80s, early 90s of renewable natural gas. Quasar Energy Group is in the process of selling off their digesters, not really because of any problems or concerns, just because it's their business model to kind of do that. Basically, and again, as I mentioned, there's really not too much happening on the policy front here in Ohio related to RNG specifically. We need to see more there. Bottom line, I would say, is that we see a lot of potential, and I'd say we see it across the network of clean cities organizations that we work with. Huge potential for RNG, really where the industry is going in terms of any kind of natural gas vehicle utilization. But we really need more education. Kind of one issue in terms of Ohio on the fleet side is that we've had dialogue with fleets about RNG and about how they can seamlessly transition to using RNG at no additional cost, no change in operations. And we hear that's just too good to be true. We don't believe it. So obviously we need more education there. We also need more funding. We would love to do more work as a nonprofit. We have to depend on funding sources to support the work we're doing. We see a lot of potential. We have a tremendous amount of funding to work on electric vehicles and really none to work on RNG. And we feel that's something that needs to change. Just as a final reminder, the DOE Clean Cities Network, you can access that by searching for DOE Clean Cities, find a local coalition near you, and happy to answer any questions that I can. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks very much. Now we'll turn to our final speaker before opening it up to some questions. Chris Voll is an advocate for methane capture and use for more than 30 years. And he has worked at the Environmental Protection Agency and in the Global Change Division, 2 private RNG developers, the Solid Waste Association of North America, and represented the U.S. government in Global Methane Initiative. He currently works for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark and helps advance solutions for biogas and RNG from Denmark in the North American market. So, Chris, anxious to hear your comments.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here with you all. I want to thank WRI and appreciate being able to have worked with WRI over the last several years on the RNG work. It's great. It's an exciting time to be in biogas and RNG. I've been in this field since 1986, and it's really time to scale this industry. Only have a short amount of time. I'm going to try to just bring some highlights to you about how Denmark's journey in RNG has evolved. Next slide, please. So just the lay of the land, Denmark has some very aggressive climate goals. And the important part of this slide is that agriculture plays a huge part in Denmark's economy. About 2/3 of the land is under ag. They have, like we have in the US, experienced problems with water contamination and soil contamination in their past. And so that has driven much of what we're going to talk about in terms of properly treating agriculture waste, manure, food waste, and generating RNG as a result of that. As you can see, a large percentage of the Danish greenhouse gas estimates are from agriculture, and about 55% of that is methane. Next slide. So there's been a journey that has occurred really in the last 8 or so years. Prior to that, there was approximately 100 digester projects in Denmark, 50 on farm, and about the same number at wastewater treatment plants. But post 2012, we've seen the growth of about 40 centralized co-digestion to RNG plants. And these are processing anywhere between 300,000 and 1 million tons a year. 300,000 is a large project right now in the US market. So you can see that the scale in Denmark is impressive. Another important point here is that the feedstock going into these 40 plants, about 13% is food and other organic waste streams, but those yield greater than 50% of the biogas. So co-digestion of manure and other organics is a pillar of the Danish biogas model. Right now, about 15% of the total dairy and hog manure is used for biogas production in Denmark. Next slide. So why has it been a priority? I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. Obviously, like many European countries, where your energy comes from is important. So becoming more energy independent, but just as important as I just mentioned is properly managing manure and protecting air, land, and water resources. How did they get there? There has been a rapid and professionalization of the industry, a lot of collaboration across sectors, and last but not least is farmer buy-in and the formation of cooperatives of farmers to support these large projects. Next slide. So certainly going to just let you read this slide, but as was mentioned earlier for Oregon, there is definitely a patchwork of different drivers, some that are incentive driven, some that are regulatory. Draw to your attention that by 2023, there's a real focus on food waste and removing it from the stream to a higher and better use. And so it really has taken this an evolution of different policies to get us where we are today. Next slide. So want to just quickly, this slide comes from a company called Nature Energy, a very interesting company. 10 years ago, they were a supplier of fossil natural gas. They have evolved to be a 100% renewable natural gas company. But I show this really to show that anaerobic digestion really is seen as a part of an integrated system. And Nature Energy currently owns 12 of these plants. A couple of things to draw out here. If you see in the middle of the slide where it says combined with hydrogen gives green gas, definitely is a large uptick in interest in power to gas or power to X as it's referred to in Denmark. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of a typical plant. I think I've made most of these points already, but that is a good example of one of those 40 plants that I talked about. Next slide. So where has all of that gotten Denmark to? In 2020, renewable natural gas constituted 15% of the Danish gas consumption. Because of that shift to these large centralized co-digestion facilities, there's been a fourfold increase in RNG production since 2012. This comes primarily from manure and food waste and other agricultural products. And due to the plants that are already under construction, it's expected that that will go to 25 to 30% by 2023. Next slide. Next slide. This is an important point to make. This is an analysis from the Danish Energy Agency where the projection is that even after maximum theoretical electrification of many of the industries in Denmark, there will still be 25% remaining that cannot be served by more windmills or, I'm sorry, oh boy, my colleague's gonna kill me, wind turbines or solar panels. And so it just shows that we need additional renewable energy sources for some of our thermal needs. Next slide, please. And that will do it. I rushed through that, but I wanted to try to keep us on time. These are the companies that I represent, things from food waste pretreatment to enzyme treatment of food waste and other organics, biogas cleaning and upgrading, and many of the components and solutions for digestion and biogas upgrade. So thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. And that does leave us about 15 minutes for Q&A here. We'll open it up to the panel. I'll direct some questions to individuals, but I'll give other people a chance to weigh in if they want. And I think we can maybe take the slide down so we can get a gallery view here if possible. But let me start with a basic question about state level analysis. We got a question beforehand. Is there a recipe for state level analysis of RNG potential and opportunities? Rebecca Smith, you want to start on that, and then maybe Tom, if you want to chime in, if that makes sense.
Sure, thank you. So in Oregon, one of the pillars of our process for the RNG inventory was convening an advisory group, and that had stakeholders from all over the state. And one, it helped us to get buy-in from a lot of these stakeholders. And then two, it helped us to really refine our processes in terms of collecting that data and then analyzing it. Another aspect I would say is that collaboration with a lot of state and federal agencies on data. One area where data was definitely difficult to collect was on food waste. So a lot of those entities, there's a lot of food production in Oregon, and they were not willing to share their data on food waste. So that was something that they would gladly sell to us, but they would not provide. But we really found invaluable amounts of data from other state and federal agencies. And so that's what helped us to build what we think is a very robust analysis of the technology.
And I just jumping in on that as well. I don't think there's a recipe per se, but there's certainly frameworks, and there's a few states that have provided, I think, really good frameworks for how this can be done, and Oregon is one of them, right? So a first step, and this is sort of what we lay out in this most recent guidance paper that we released. A first step is sort of to do an inventory of waste-derived resources in your particular state or region. Second step is to sort of identify economic opportunities based on that assessment. So are there resources that are co-located, right? Because especially with distributed resources like animal manure or potentially food waste projects, there's a need for centralized production in order to make the economics work, similar to what Chris was talking about earlier. And then a third step is identifying, based on those opportunities, identifying the priorities and how projects sort of link to different state level priorities and how to develop the right policies to make sure that those are linking up. So, there's a lot that states can do, as we mentioned earlier. But aligning, RNG project development with goals like reducing emissions from organic waste, reducing those methane emissions, and also aligning RNG projects with co-benefits like reducing, for example, animal manure pollution in watersheds or air quality impacts from waste streams are also important things to consider. So. Yeah, again, I think there's some good frameworks out there. Oregon has done great work. Washington State, California, Iowa has developed a really good tool assessing resource potential. So there's a lot happening and a lot of good examples to draw from.
Great, thank you. Let me switch gears a little bit and talk about the use of RNG, mostly in heavy duty trucking right now. So Sam, the question for you is, do you see that continuing over the next 5 to 10 years? think we'll see the introduction of some the famous Tesla Semi and other competition on the electrification side. Can you talk about sort of how you see the demand for RNG evolving and how it fits into a broader decarbonization of the transport sector?
Yeah, well, thanks, Dan. I think we're going to see, it's going to be a function of a combination of market evolution. How expensive diesel is a big driver for any of these alternatives, whether it's RNG or anything else. So I think just the market where we see diesel prices is going to be a major factor. I think policy will be another factor. Candidly, my personal view is that we're still many years away from really aggressive electrification of the heavy duty trucking sector, especially long haul. I think we'll see some real rapid gains in that sector on things like terminal tractors, last mile, maybe regional freight. We'll begin to see that. I think natural gas vehicles I think are going to have a role to play in the sector, especially big trucks and long haul, for a long time. And we see RNG, perhaps policy driven, really as the future of natural gas vehicles in the heavy duty sector.
Thanks. And speaking of competition between alternative fuels and diesel, Chris, I want to come to you with a question about sort of what you see as the future of technology. Are there technology breakthroughs for lowering the cost of RNG on the horizon, or other approaches that will make it more competitive in the market?
Well, people a lot smarter than I, Dan, have said that we're not really going to see the type of technology breakthrough that we might see for instance, wind turbine and solar, where there was this incremental decrease in cost over time. That does not mean that there are not efficiency gains to be had. One of the things, in all honesty, in Denmark that's going on right now is an analysis of the current anaerobic digester fleet, looking at the overall environmental benefits of it, but also taking into account things like leakage and other aspects. So I do think that there can be some technology advances. I think they'll be incremental though, and not necessarily immediately transformative, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Well, that brings me to a broader question. We've had a couple different versions of this question about how RNG fits into the broader decarbonization of the economy, and specifically, are there risks around investments in RNG creating stranded assets in the gas infrastructure? If we are moving away from fossil gas at the same time we're investing in RNG, what are the risks there, and how do we manage those from a policy perspective? And I'll open that up to anybody who wants to chime in.
I'll jump in. So certainly this is a conversation that we're seeing out west and in Oregon, and it's part of a larger conversation around, electricity decarbonization in general. And we've had a number of decarbonization reports for the West that have found that decarbonizing the electricity load to at least something, retaining 5, 6, 7% natural gas is exponentially more affordable than that last 100%. Odo is neutral on that. However, there are those who suggest that there may be a future for a while in natural gas for decarbonization. What role renewable natural gas would play in that is questionable given the low supplies, but overall electricity decarbonization is more affordable when it's part of an economy-wide decarbonization, and natural gas can really provide a lot of renewable natural gas can provide a lot of that decarbonization of those difficult to abate sectors, as you mentioned. So that's where we're at right now in Oregon, and our largest natural gas utility, Northwest Natural, has been very aggressive in its decarbonization planning, and it's looking closely at RNG and at hydrogen as a way to continue to decarbonize its mix, and hopefully still, provide service.
Dan, I guess if I could add in a quick comment, and I think, I think it was Rebecca actually that brought this up early in her comments, is I think we do need to look at the co-benefits. And I don't know if this is specifically to your question, but we have 9 states currently that have food waste diversion laws in place in the country. And, meeting those goals, is going to be difficult, but I see RNG as a pole to help meet those broader environmental goals as well as producing RNG. So I think that's one thing that has served as a bit of a hurdle and a barrier, is that people look at biogas simply from an energy perspective. And I'll offer that it's much more than that. And so you asked me in the earlier question about technology fixes. I don't know that technology fixes will necessarily get us where we need to go, but policy fixes where we try to look at this more in a holistic viewpoint could make a big difference. And co-digestion, there's some definite policy, in my humble opinion, some policy disconnects in our treatment of food waste and being co-digested and then lowering the value of a project. So, all right, I'll be quiet now and let others speak. So.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Sam.
Just to build on that, I mean, I think not only the food waste diversion point, but agricultural wastes and this, this issue of uncontrolled methane emissions. I mean, I think that really is the framework to think about this, but it's got to be driven by policy, and hopefully that's what we will see.
Yeah, just to build on that, another question that came in was around the sources of RNG, and does it require collecting waste from CAFOs? Is that a major source? And do we expect the sort of availability of those organic materials to change over time if people are reducing meat in their diet, or other regulatory changes, or consumer preference changes that might reduce the prevalence of CAFOs? Or do we see that as a sort of steady source of organic material?
I think over time, Dan, indications are people may start to reduce that and already have, but I certainly don't see the meat or dairy industry going away anytime soon. So from my perspective, I think we're going to have manure for a long period to come.
And I would just like to add that if you remember Oregon's RNG inventory, the biggest theoretical potential comes from thermal gasification of dry biomass. And especially in Oregon, we are a wildfire state. We are looking actively at how to handle woody biomass from wildfire prevention. If we can bring down that thermal gasification and cost, that is a source that dwarfs the anaerobic digestion and would be, I think, a more sustainable source, in that we would continue to see a lot of it.
Great, thank you so much. I think we're going to leave it there for the Q&A. Appreciate everybody joining us today, and the panel for that conversation. I think we heard a clear message around thinking through the co-benefits, whether it's on fire risk reduction or methane emissions to the atmosphere, is a key component of designing a strategy around RNG, and that makes a lot of sense. But been a lot of interest in this webinar, so I appreciate everybody joining us. And again, the webinar itself, the slide decks, will be available on our website at the events page. And if you did have questions that we weren't able to get to, sorry about that. We will circulate those questions to the panelists, and they may follow up with you to answer specific questions that we did not get to today. But with that, thanks again for joining us, and that is the end of today's webinar.